Washington.
Oh, yes, indeed. You are now listening to Darker Than Blue on WPFW in Washington, D.C. I'm your host, Sean Blackmon, here with Jacquie Luqman,
Hey,
and we
y'all.
are your number one source for struggle, socialism, and soul. And I want to welcome everyone to today's show. It is Friday, January 6, 2024. And we want to kick today's show off with some local news. And we're very happy to be joined for this conversation by Netfa Freeman, an organizer with Pan-African Community Action and the host of Voices with Vision, which you can hear right here on WPFW every Tuesday at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Netfa, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you for having me. It was used to be under other auspices, but now I'm glad to see y'all part of this family, PFW family, with us.
Absolutely. And Netfa, today we wanted to talk about this proposed omnibus crime bill that seems like it's gotten approval from the DC Council. And like so many crime measures that we see put forth in DC, I mean, it fundamentally seems like a racist attack on the poor and working people of Washington, D.C., or at least what's left of those communities. So I was hoping you could help us understand some of the context of this crime bill, what's in it, and what you see as its potential impact.
Okay, yeah. So this bill was introduced by Councilperson Brooke Pinto. It was earlier this year, and then was passed unanimously first by the DC's Council Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety. Now, one of the things that I think is important, and it has a whole bunch of provisions that we should be very wary of, like anti-mask wearing, provisions that claim that if you're, wearing a mask and for the purpose of committing a crime, it's a lot of vague things. There's stuff about collecting names of people who are jumping in terms of the metro, and taking their names. And if you refuse to give it, then you'll be subject to arrest. There are a number of provisions, creating drug-free zones, which means that any zone, a geographical area that they claim is a drug use area, they want to make it drug-free, then it would be illegal to have gatherings in those areas for a particular period of time. I think it was like 5 days. I can't remember now, but the point is the power, those who have the power to do these things are really creating, are really trying to preserve and uphold really an exploitative order, essentially an exploitative order. They're not looking at and they're doing it under the guise of trying to fight crime, and they're not looking at the root issues that cause crime in the first place. And we have to say street crime or petty low-level crime. We have to put it that way because people just need to understand it in that level, because we're not talking about crimes like the capitalists stealing our wages or anything like that. And those are not even crime. They're not felonies right there. And so we're a Pan-African Community Action, and we're developing a paper on it right now. And we just had a Status Shakur study group session on it last Wednesday. We see this as an outgrowth an outgrowth or manifestation of the fact that we are a people, particularly Black working class and indigenous people, non-white people in the DC area, are a colonized people. We're occupied. And these things the bills largely expanding the powers of the occupation forces known as the police in our communities to relegate our mobility to the areas, the ghettos where they want to keep us, the ghettos that are on the periphery of the metropoles. We're really pretty much only supposed to go there if we're working, on the behalf of capitalists, if we're serving our labor, serving them. If you ain't got no job, you're not supposed to have no business being there. And you under suspicion for being those undesirables that cause crime. And maybe somebody might be there for doing something, whoever, people have to survive, and they do whatever. They do what the system meets them out to do. And so we have to see the bill. One, we have to see this bill as that. Really, it's not something that the policymakers are doing for the in the interest, even though it seems they might say it is, but in the interest of the working classes and the people who are in our communities, but it's really to preserve the capitalist order. And it actually demonstrates that this is the distinction between representative democracy and participatory democracy. And representative democracy, we just all we can do is vote for people who claim to be working in our best interest, and then they go behind closed doors, and then they also go behind closed doors, and we don't have access to the closed doors, but you know who do have access. That's the rich and the business class. And then they make policies that are designed for that interest, and they come out and tell us those policies are designed for our interests. So things that are the root causes of the street level crime, I mean, like you could say, just unemployment and displacement and all of these things that are the root causes of the crime are not addressed. And that we know what it is. If people don't have food insecurity, then you feed people. These are the things that capitalism won't do, because it will it undermines its interests. It's more like socialism, what y'all like to talk about.
Yes, it's a scary S word. You know what, Netfa, you talked about, the capitalist class and the petty bourgeoisie elements behind these tough on crime initiatives. What's the significance of a council member Pinto being the one to introduce this bill? What ward does she represent in DC, and why is that really important in the provisions that are in this bill, which many of them which actually are not new?
Mm-hmm. Well, Pinto is in Ward 2, I believe. This is Ward 2. And this is not where our people are. And it's pretty much a business, and kind of much a business district. It's like really, it's all downtown. It's like where are we now? Yeah, are we in Ward 2 right now? I'm sorry, I'm at IPS, just to let you know I'm at my job. So I guess that constitutes Ward 2. But this is, this is where the fundamental interests are. She doesn't care about what's happening across the east of the river or anything like that. And so anything that she designs is really going to be predicated on her purview of what's in the interest of that class, the business class. And so there's not really going to talk about. So, for example, if we were to so this is the significance of it. It actually demonstrates that we are not empowered to implement, to come up with, implement, and protect the policies and programs and ideas that are in our favor, that come from us. They come from people that have other than our interests as working class, and people, and also Black people, because and I want to just say Black people. I don't like to just, because there's other people besides Black people that are non-white people, but also particularly essentially there's the working class, and working class non-white people is what constitutes the colonized class in the settler colonial situation. And so the significance, to answer your question, the significance is that it demonstrates to us that we have to be fighting for power, and we have to be fighting for, and where I was going, really, the difference between representative democracy and participatory democracy. Bills like this, and also the media and everything, make us believe that we don't have any other choice but to put our trust in these policymakers. But there are other systems, where people can come together in assemblies and hash out things and identify the problem. It undermines what we should be, what is known as informed consent. Informed consent is the condition where the people who are impacted by a particular policy or program actually understand the implications of those programs. They understand the alternatives of those programs, where there might be a better alternative or not better alternative. They know all of this. So when we see the news, and they put the news in front of the microphone from somebody's face that really is of us, but may not be as informed to the inherent nature of capitalism, the inherently exploitative nature of capitalism that marginalizes people and then they are going to support the bills and the ideas that come from the ruling class. But that's an uninformed idea. And so we're getting consent, but it's not informed consent. And so we have to be able to, informed consent means we all come together and we look at this thing, turn it over, and are able to implement and enforce those things that we come up with.
Yeah, definitely. And, the question of class in this, Netfa, is so important, especially in a city like Washington, D.C., that has this reputation of being quote unquote progressive, and a city government that has a reputation for being supposedly progressive. But in reality, particularly when we talk about the rapacious process of gentrification and displacement, we see that the interest of poor, working, and oppressed people in this city are almost always cast aside for the sake of profit in ways that you've laid out so far in our conversation. And I got to say, maybe this is an aside, but I'm actually not surprised to see this from Brooke Pinto. I mean, not that long ago, I saw a video that some folks had published where they approached Brooke Pinto asking about, whether she would demand a ceasefire with Israel's deepening genocide in Gaza. And her response was something like, well, that's not in the interest of, people in my ward or people in DC. Now, never mind the fact that $15 million comes from DC that goes to Israel every year. But this is the kind of dishonesty that we deal with these so-called progressives. And also, I saw a really interesting quote, swinging back around specifically to the point of this omnibus crime bill. Excuse me. I was reading in the Hilltop, which is the student newspaper of Howard University, and they were writing about this, and they quoted Fatima Nair, who owns Mama's Pizza Kitchen in Southeast DC, which is a longtime restaurant in Southeast for those who may not know. And I thought it was interesting what she said. She said, quote, "I've had many robberies at my establishment, but nothing will change unless people have some kind of hope. They have no direction. The whole system is making this happen," talking about crime. So I'm not blaming anybody. The council members think they know, but they don't. So Miss Nair, someone who has been the direct recipient and who has been a victim of the very kind of crime that this bill seemingly seeks to address, is pointing out how ineffective it will be if implemented, because it doesn't address the fundamental issues facing poor, working, and communities in Washington, D.C. at a systematic level. But whenever this issue comes up in this town, and it does rather often, the deeper issues undergirding all of these things rarely get discussed. That there's never any discussion about the alleviation of poverty, or the raising of wages, or the improving of benefits and healthcare and people like this. All of these things that would have a direct positive impact in addressing crime always gets glossed over. But the response in DC, as we often see across this country, is always putative and is always focused on further empowering the police and the mass incarceration state to try to jail the social problems that are wrought by the capitalist system. You know what I mean?
I mean, I think there's a few things what you said makes me think of, and I can't remember. One of them was the very first thing when you mentioned Pinto's quote, and about it not being in the interest of, she said, her constituents, in the interest of DC. Now, and one level, I know you're right when you say dishonest. I agree with you. There's a level of intellectual dishonesty there, and I think what also comes with intellectual dishonesty is a psychosis of denial. It may not be a conscious denial. They really can't conceive. They don't see us as people. That's for one thing. So, in the interest of people in DC, well, we're not people. The people that the young people that the like, for example, the parents, or maybe that young mother who may be or the young mother who may be the parent of somebody who's committing these, they're not people. But in fact, they'll say, well, you need to do something with your kids. Part of the problem is you, right? But then the other part of the reoccurrence and the re-implementation of crime bills, the use of them as punitive measures that really inherently expand the powers of police and expand the powers of the what's it called when you the judiciary, the courts and all that kind of stuff. I'm sorry, my brain is, the crime bills always do this. They're not just on the local levels, though. They're also on the federal levels. 1968 crime bill, 1994 crime bill, and they're always a response to their reactionary response to the reoccurring deteriorating conditions of capitalism. They can't admit, they can't change the system, so they redo these things. And then sometimes they'll implement a lot of reforms to like a pressure valve. And those reforms are usually in response to us, mobilizing in mass and making political acts, even if it's burning down the city, burning down. Remember the Kerner Commission report and all that kind of stuff. They know what to do. That's where your dishonesty comment comes in. I mean, is spied on observation comes in. But at the same time, they live in a different world. The purview that exists for them is different, and that we have to begin to actually see what we need to do is organize the people, and that there's also, and I'll stop here. There's also these bodies. There's not a democracy really, and that's where our people get the illusion. We think there's democracy because we can vote, and that what I remember, Deruba Birmahad, our brother, he calls it democratic fascism, and I don't know if he coined that himself, democratic fascism. But what is referring to is a couple things. Is where we, the voting, those who preside, we get to vote on who presides over our oppression, pretty much. We're not voting for anything. And there's another aspect to it too. It's the real democratic processes are reserved for the bourgeois class, like, who controls the Senate and House, and which is beholden to the rich, things like the Electoral College. On the DC level, the National Capital Planning Commission, we don't control none of this stuff. It controls us, and maybe one of y'all can help me. I was trying to remember the name of this body. It's pretty much, it's an unelected body, like on the DC level of businesses and whatnot. I can't remember the name of it. I remember we were doing some stuff years ago, protesting, and we kept talking about it, and a lot of people didn't.
I know what you mean. The name escapes me.
Yeah. But anyway, these are the ways in which decisions are made on the behalf of the people, but we're outside of those decisions. And what we have to begin to figure out is, how do we organize ourselves to shift power in the hands of the working class, and out of the hands of because then we can reimagine real solutions. That's where the real solutions coming from. People who are directly impacted and connected to the quote unquote crime, and know what affects it, and aren't worried about what's happening in like War II, and not designing policies that are really, to help War II, because there's stuff with the metro, getting on the metro and anti-mask wearing stuff. It's really about relegating the mobility of colonized people. You're not supposed to go any place unless you come in to work for us or spend money, on our businesses and whatnot.
Yeah, and Netfa, the implications for an already like marginalized and what's left of Chocolate City here in DC, because you can't call it Chocolate City anymore. The implications of these kinds of legislations, they reach beyond like, fining people and possibly imprisoning people. There are implications for housing and education and other things so when these city council members who are living in the wards in the city that are really not impacted by the root problems, and the root problem is not crime, the root problem is a whole bunch of other stuff, whole bunch of other social stuff. I mean, what are the far-reaching implications for not meeting the needs of the people? And that's the root of this fear that people have of crime. It's that people's needs aren't being met, their basic human rights needs, in the richest country, in a society in the richest country in the world.
Those things that we said, poverty and addiction. We don't say things like addiction, because when people self-medicate, then we have to deal with that. Those the kind of things lead to stuff. Food insecurity. Where the safe and healthy food accessible in our communities, and actually adequate housing, inadequate housing, but also the meaning self-images that come from this capitalism media. But the consequences of that is a deteriorating society, one that concentrates power more and creates what they would deem as, even if they, and I think some of them use the expression, an expendable population, a surplus population of people that we don't need. You ain't got no job. You can't buy our stuff. You can't work for us because you're not, we won't hire you because you're not the kind of people that we want to hire. So that population gets bigger under neoliberal capitalism. Neoliberal capitalism, that system that values and measures the value of things and people based on their utility to profit, pretty much, and devises policies. I see neoliberal capitalism. They always say capitalism is the laissez-faire, where just let the government, the market do things. Well, neoliberal capitalism says, now we're going to actually do stuff with the government, implement policies to give more, to the capitalists and whatnot. So it's almost a contradiction or hypocrisy in that sense, the implementation of austerity and all of these things. But basically that's the answer to your question. It's just going to, create it. It further exacerbates the things that it claims to be wanting to solve.
Yeah, Nefa, I know that there have been local groups here in Washington, D.C. that have been doing a lot of work in organizing around this issue. And so I was hoping you could talk about what the fight back against this crime bill has looked like, and how important that aspect of organizing is in really addressing these things that clearly will have the potential to have a negative impact on a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm an organization, Pan-African Community Action, known as PACA, and we know and we understand that community control is important in order to recognize the power, the shift in power that's needed. There are other organizations, not just us. Black Lives Matter DC, there's Harris, Wildland Streams, are all doing things. First step is to raise awareness about this bill and the real nature of it. A lot of people know what's happening, but they don't understand what it's going to do. So these organizations are doing that. The PACA, we know that community control, we say, of police is one of the things, but it's not only police. We know that if the people can come together and organize themselves, decision-making bodies like people's assemblies and councils and those kind of things, and sort of tackle and identify the various issues that plague the community to exacerbate crime, like returning citizens, how we deal with returning citizens, how we deal with turf wars and addiction and all those kind of things, and then say what is the solution, what can we do if we have control over the resources and everything like the state does and others do, what will we implement? So we have to first realize we can do it and then fight for that. So it's a two-pronged thing where we're organizing and actually implementing to the best of the ability and the little resources we can what we come up with, but then also it would be like but also attack exposing the legitimacy of the state and the working class in terms of the illegitimacy and their disingenuous nature. And so we have to have campaigns that do that. And I didn't mention Stop Police Terror Project, but in terms of another one of the organizations that's out here. So that's the thing. It's like showing people, well, we have to come together and offer solutions to the community that the rest they want to throw away. And the people that we want to throw, and that are part of our community, they're extension of us, and that we also have to expose the criminality, really the criminality of the system. These are top dogs. They do real crime, like just wipe your neighborhood out. Displace right. You and like human rights violations. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. And I mean, particularly now, and we're going to get into this with Erica in a few minutes, I think we have to look at our struggle domestically, Netfa, from an international lens. Yes. Like this situation in DC is not just a DC situation. We're talking about gentrification, but how is gentrification different from the mass displacement of people in an ethnic cleansing or a genocidal campaign that's being carried out in, another country? How is that? How do we see these as the same things?
Well, some may argue that in form, some may argue they're different, but they're only talking about form or intensity, or even what we say, how can I say, the time, the rapidity of something. But gentrification, and the only difference is only in form, but not in essence. It's essentially the same thing. It's essentially racist. It's essentially colonialism and imperialism, and that they all involve agents that will kill you and enforce, their laws and like you see, because it make me think of, obviously everyone's talking about Gaza right now, Palestinians, and the IDF and the police forces in Israel train with the police forces in the United States. I mean, they share, they're both settler colonies, but they're also both capitalist. Everything's capitalist, so it doesn't even have, even if it's not a settler colony. So the thing might be, you might have, like, in Haiti, there are a lot of people who are forced to migrate because of the the conditions there, exploitative conditions there, intensification, and also the essence of it is the propaganda against it, the disinformation about what is a central issue is the same for all of these places. So whereas right now in Gaza, Israel's been doing this campaign of bombardment and everything in this kind of period of time, but it goes back 75 years. And in the U.S., there's the genocide of indigenous people and the movement, and even you could say the slow genocide of our people, of Black people. All these things are essential to what this means, and it's the only difference is how fast it's going and maybe the overt nature of it.
Yeah, Neff, we got about 5 minutes left, and I actually wanted to get your opinion on, and you talked about this some, but this whole ski mask ban, because it's not just we're seeing this in DC. This is something that is spreading more and more across the country. I think it became law in Philadelphia recently, and I've also seen reports of it being considered in Atlanta. And it's pretty absurd because obviously there's nothing inherently criminal about wearing a ski mask. Wearing a ski mask does not mean that you are about to commit a crime. If you live in a city like DC or Philly, where it gets rather cold, you're probably just trying to keep your face warm. But when you consider that these types of ski masks are generally popular, particularly with young Black men,
That's right.
I think it really sort of shows what's really happening in terms of how this is being used to criminalize poor working and oppressed communities, and just the very obvious racist way that sort of thing plays out. I think it is pretty clear. But like, how do you see that aspect of it? Because the fact that that's even included and that's becoming more and more of a thing here in the U.S., I think sort of shows a troublesome pattern.
No, I mean, I agree with you. I mean, that's what I would start, is concurring with everything that you said, and to add on to it, we have to, what it really essentially does, because it serves no other purpose but this, is to expand the the boundaries, the borders in which they expand the envelopment of people into the criminal justice system. And it gives the police, again, powers to deem somebody suspicious, what they call articulable suspicion. If you have articulable suspicion, then they can jam you up for having this mask, which means what it basically means is giving the police more flexibility to criminalize, to identify and deem someone is a criminal. And then these are these law terms that really just mean, oh, they got to at least be able to explain and justify what they mean. Well, there's still a whole lot of wiggle room in there. He was doing this and he made this motion and whatnot. And It doesn't really, these are things that don't add to or help identify an offense, so to speak. I'm trying not to use the word criminal because I just hate the way that. So, for example, somebody's going to do something that's against the law, steal a purse, steal whatever, steal from a store. It doesn't increase the damage of that act because they wore a mask. And it doesn't, so it doesn't really do anything. And if somebody does something that is against law and harmful to other people, the act itself is not increased in severity. In fact, the language actually suggests that it does. But it kind of implies, some kind of, like fear, you're inducing fear or something like that. And so it's really, like you said, it's really criminalizing and casting a sort of how do I want to say, not just propaganda, but like a stereotype, a trope on people who are doing that. And like you said, there's a lot of young people just wear things, it's the thing to do, whatever. And then we're still in a pandemic, quite frankly. It's right now, it's a spike. Some people, and I don't think I could be wrong, do the provisions exclude masks with like a surgical mask or N95's mask? It does do that. I don't think it does. I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't think
Sure.
it does. It
Right.
doesn't
But
make
even
a
if it
distinction.
did, sometimes people just put something else on top of it. You might want another layer of protection, or you might think it looks better than the surgical thing, whatever. It's really, like you said, really just nothing except for expanding the their spread of who they can cast in their net of criminality.
Absolutely. And my friend, this is the same kind of sharp analysis that you can hear every Tuesday at 9 a.m. on Voices with Vision that is hosted by Netfa Freeman. Netfa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome to the airways with us.
Absolutely. Appreciate you, brother. Peace.
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 Yeah, and Jacquie, as we wait on our next guest, when we talk about community control of anything, it's really all about a question of power, because it's the state that so often uses that power and has this monopoly on violence that allows these sorts of crime bills that can completely ignore the issues of our class and further empower these bodies of the state, like the police, the prisons, and the courts, to brutalize, and I think in this case, push out whole communities of people. But be that as it may, I want to introduce our next guest for today. We are joined by Erica Ryan, coordinating committee member and coordinator of the Baltimore Citywide Alliance for the Black Alliance for Peace. Erica, thanks for joining us.
Peace. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely. Well,
yep, loud and clear.
Oh, yeah, we can hear you. And Erica, we appreciate you joining us today because we wanted to discuss the recently released decision by the International Court of Justice on the case that South Africa brought on charges of genocide against Israel. And the ICJ has ordered that, quote, the state of Israel shall take measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of this convention, meaning the prevention and punishment of the crime of genocide, in particular, killing members of the group, meaning Palestinians, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. The court also ordered that Israel, quote, prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide in relation to members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip, and enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. And while the peace sort of stopped short of calling for a ceasefire, which is a popular demand within this issue, South African Foreign Minister Naledi Pandor described this as a kind of de facto call for ceasefire because, quote, in exercising the order, there would have to be a ceasefire. And I feel like there's a lot that's bound up in this, Erica. I tend to think that it's still sort of a noteworthy development as Israel's deepening genocide on Gaza continues. But I don't want to do too much editorializing. I'm definitely curious your thoughts.
Yeah, excuse me. Well, I will preface and say, claim no easy victories, right? But I do think that today is a historic day, and what South Africa has been able to do by bringing this to the International Court of Justice has been historic, if not because this has been the first time that there has been receipts, right? We have 80 plus pages of things that has been done, things that have been said, and I always talk about the usefulness or utility of these courts, right? We're not necessarily looking for a win, but I think the way that we gauge or understand wins should be looked at differently. For instance, including with the fights for community control. If we are agitating a community around that particular fight and we don't win, but more people are aware of this fight and more people have joined into that fight, is that a loss? And I think that that's really what the ICJ case has really emphasized, because in the demand that Israel stop killing civilians and destroying civilian infrastructure and medical facilities, they do stop short of calling for a ceasefire, but I do think that folks should be wary of the sort of narrative that we see with the New York Times or even MSNBC today, where they are harping on that specifically, right? Because I think it aligns with the sort of policies that we have seen with the Biden administration, where they are pretending that they are, he's secretly talking to Netanyahu in the background somewhere and condemning him, but we don't see it front, face front or a front facing, excuse me, rather. And so that's really the situation that we're seeing unfolding, where we're watching these liberal mainstream media platforms really play with that language.
Mm.
And I think that as organizers, we have to be careful in terms of how we depict what happened today.
Yeah, I think that's really important to highlight because what we see happens so often, Erica, when information is shared over social media, people don't actually read the document, right? So they carry a narrative that they heard from someone else, and they don't have the details right. So I think that's what kind of happened a little bit with the ICJ announcement. There's the time difference. Like when I woke up at 9 o'clock this morning, the announcement was already out because of the several hours. So I literally didn't have time to read the document until later on in the day. And then I realized, okay, the fact that they didn't specifically call for a ceasefire doesn't negate the fact that in their document, they demanded that Israel stop all genocidal activities, meaning stop. They literally said, stop killing Palestinian people, stop blocking humanitarian aid, stop destroying infrastructure. And a little bit of clarity, well, actually, a lot of clarity was provided by Ali Abunimah, who was one of the co-founders of the Electronic Intifada. And he said, a ceasefire is what you demand in an armed conflict. In a genocide, you demand an immediate end to all genocidal acts. And that's exactly what the ICJ ordered with immediate effect. And he said, please stop helping Israel spin its historic defeat as a win. So understanding that maybe we kind of got some of the narrative wrong earlier in the day, that because they didn't call for a ceasefire, maybe this wasn't enough. Now that we understand this a little bit better, how big of a PR loss, and ideology, a chink in the ideology armor that the Zionist entity has been able to prop up, how big of a deal is this ruling to dismantling the Zionist state? I mean, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but how big of a step do you think this is to getting to that point, Erica?
Yeah, I think it's huge. Again, when I noted that this is a historic case, to even have taken it to the ICJ, 80 pages that people can read for themselves and see and touch and feel, and know that these things are actually happening. And I think in terms of the utility of what we saw, certainly they did not call for a ceasefire in those exact terms. But then, if they have named that what's happening to Gaza and what Israel is doing does fall under the Genocide Convention in 1948, that they do recognize that Palestinians have a right to be protected against that, what does that mean then for the US to is still arming, right? So I'm always thinking about, how do we use these situations?
Mm-hmm.
Well, if the demand right now, the prominent demand right now in the US is to call for ceasefires, and we're seeing these states and these city councils not budge, then we could take the ICJ case and say, well, they clearly said, and
That's right.
as a court, that is not really their place, because Hamas technically is not a state, right? So they can't
Right.
jump in and
Mm-hmm.
deal with that conflict directly, but you can, and you can force your Congress to,
Mm-hmm.
and you can make the president, so we can use this moment to revisit the UN SC, or the UN Security Council, and push for this in a way that we weren't able to before. And this is if you are using the ceasefire as a prominent call in your organizing right now. So I don't think that any of these things is invaluable, right? And I do find an issue with the way that these tools are sort of brushed off. Um, because I think that they are seen as some sort of belief in a system, right? I don't think anybody believes in these courts. I think there's a particular strategic and tactical understanding about the use of these courts. Similarly, if we were to, charge for genocide, which we have, right? And then even more recently in 2021, there was another charge for genocide. And it's not to say that there's any expectation that the ICJ was going to go in and stop Israel, but it is to say that we now have more leverage to put pressure on the people that we voted in as constituents to make them react in the way that we would like them to react.
Yeah, and when you talk about the strategic and tactical value of these types of institutions, Erica, I think that's very important, particularly as organizers and as a movement. And I think that's why it's important that people do see this as the historic event that you describe it as, and as the victory that you describe it as. Because, yeah, the ICJ is not like a revolutionary guerrilla military unit that's going to put boots on the ground and go and free, Palestine all on its own. And I think we've got to remember that it has been the steadfast resistance of the Palestinian people and the global solidarity movement with Palestine that has even made something like this possible, in my opinion. And then to have South Africa, of all places, be the country that brought this case. And, South Africa, of course, is a living historical example of how apartheid states can be defeated, about how they are not invincible. And I think it's noteworthy that apartheid South Africa also had the full support of the United States government until that support became untenable. And that brings me to the question of how this reflects on the internal political situation here in the United States. Of course, over the last 100 or so days, every week, people in cities and towns across this country have been hitting the streets in solidarity with Palestine in mass numbers, including in places where Palestinian solidarity hasn't ever really been a thing. You know what I mean? And this has reflected very poorly on Joe Biden. I mean, folks probably saw the latest disruption. According to reports, he was disrupted about 13 or 14 different times in one sitting. And, by the end of it, he sounded like a flabbergasted cartoon character. He's like a humming, a humming, a humming. He couldn't even form a coherent sentence. And so, and as we get closer to election time, with his popularity and poll numbers dropping rapidly amongst Black people, amongst young people, I mean, he can kiss the air vote goodbye completely at this point. I mean, states like Michigan and others, I mean, he just doesn't have a shot. And so U.S. imperialism's insistence on supporting the Israeli apartheid state has sharpened the contradictions here inside the U.S. and could very likely have a serious impact on the sort of near future of politics in this country. But how do you sort of see this issue reflecting on the domestic side of things?
Yeah. Well, before I answer that, I do want to briefly say, in terms of contradictions with Azania, South Africa, particularly, is that the fundamental struggle was about settler colonialism. While they won the apartheid struggle, the fundamental issue of settler colonialism still remains. And I think that that's why it's really important that we've seen that South Africa has taken this charge, because South Africa also has its own internal contradictions that it has to deal with. But it also speaks a lot to what actually is the contradiction of Palestine, because people do often repeat that it is an apartheid state, but it is a settler colonial state with apartheid practices. And we have to be really, really clear about that, because Israel is a settler project with apartheid laws and racialization of Palestinians and normalized violence. And that is what we are seeing the resistance actually push through and try to, create a create a self-determination and self-sovereignty for themselves, because we understand, especially at Black Alliance for Peace, that peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather the achievement by popular struggle and self-defense of a world liberated from the interlocking issues of global conflict and nuclear armament and proliferation and unjust war and subversion, right? So there's all these things that have to be overcome, which is why we say, no, we don't think that the courts are necessarily going to make a change, but the ruling does shift how we're able to actually speak about what's happening and organize people around what's happening here, especially domestically, right? Because as we had this ruling today, we also had a ruling from Trump. So he has been, they made there's several cases, right? But the one with the woman, they just came back with the ruling for that. I have not gotten a chance to see it because I hopped on here, but this is what's taking up the news cycle. So the ICJ probably received 5 minutes of, oh, by the way, this happened. Oh, but they didn't say ceasefire. And then they moved on to Trump and nonstop Trump, because what they are trying to do is dispel this notion of Biden really actively partaking in this genocide. And they are trying to leverage this sort of use of democracy, and hold that over people's heads, as if to insist that a vote for Trump is a vote for the end of democracy. But what about democracy for Palestinians? Or what about democracy for Haitians? Or what about democracy for the people in Western Africa right now in the Sahel, where Blinken is? What is Blinken doing there? So we really have to understand these dynamics and these sort of okey doke dynamics that are happening within the Democratic Party, where they are trying to shift the very real fact that Biden is a neocon, that he is a war president, and he is continuing to prove that since the very first day. He has not been in the business of international affairs or trying to project some rule of law. But if they believe in the so-called rule of law, then what does that then mean? That they are supporting Israel. And I see that the Arab community in Michigan have been able to form this political bloc challenging these real issues that Biden is standing on about this so-called faux democracy that he is trying to defend, that really is a bipartisan way of how they have always interacted and supported Israel, right? And I think what we're seeing is that all being put people are having to face with that reality, right? Because they can no longer say Trump is the worst. I mean, they're trying to. That attempt will never stop, right? It's liberalism, but they can't. It doesn't hold weight, and it's continuing to lose any sort of foundation, and we're seeing that in the poll numbers.
Yeah, and I'm not even going to talk about the court, the ruling for Trump. Y'all just gonna have to look that up yourselves to find out what happened there. But I do wonder, since I hope people understand now that this ruling from the International Court of Justice is like literally just the beginning of the adjudication of these, now that they have validated the charges of genocide against Israel that South Africa brought in their case. And what that means is now the ICJ will actually go forward with hearing the case. This was just like, I don't know how you would equate it in the American alleged legal system, but this was just like approving the charges. This was not, trying the case of genocide against Israel, but the court has determined that because the charges are valid, there is merit to the charges that South Africa brought forward, the case of genocide against Israel can now go forward. So this is literally just the beginning of a process, an international legal process that could take years, right? And this is also, I think, the beginning of a couple of other countries also now taking a cue from South Africa and saying that they are going to bring the US and the UK and now Germany before the ICJ for enabling genocide in the many ways that they have. So I'm thinking about the way we organizers and people in the streets approach the conversation about Palestine now with the legitimacy of the claims of genocide against Israel now validated by the ICJ, even though Biden has said that he's not going to pay any attention to the ICJ, and Netanyahu has said that they're not going to pay any attention to anything the ICJ says. How does the way we communicate this continued fight change? And do you think the way the media handles us in this fight with Palestinians differently? Does any of that change, do you think, Erica?
Yeah, it's certainly changed. You were thinking of a pretrial hearing.
Right.
Right.
Yes.
And that's essentially what this was. And I also think that that's important that people really understand that, right? Because nothing definitively came down except that they can move forward. But again, this could take years. But I think it matters that they have said that no, we think there's enough evidence here, because that also validates organizing being able to use the evidence presented to say this is what's happening, which I think we should be using. But I think in terms of like how organizers should approach this or use this, should always be led with, well, what is your objective? Um, if you're calling for a ceasefire, if that's your objective, then your tactic changes, your strategy changes. If you're trying to use this to put pressure on particular governments to, stop supporting Israel in whatever kind of way, then again, your strategy and tactic changes. But I do think that this provides a particular usefulness for us in ways that we have not had before, and the ways that we are able to discuss Israel and Palestine, and the legitimacy of it, is validated. And I also think this, in addition to what Hamas has released, really is substantial in terms of how do we set up the conversation, right? Because I think that they've given us the PE, they've handed us the PE, right? So we don't necessarily need to reinvent the wheel. They've given us the talking points to use. And I think that we should be using those points. We should be saying no to normalization. We should be using or thinking through really comprehensive uses of boycotts, right? Not these sort of individual calls, but things that really have strategic use. And we can see tactics, or we can develop tactics using the court case and also what Hamas has released, which I do recommend that people because it does give a sort of historical background to an understanding of why this would have occurred, and that this did not start October 7th. And then you can see from the ICJ case where it takes off from a point of October 7th, where you can see, okay, so they really upped the ante since. So this is a real case of genocide that we need to really be taking seriously. And then also, to the question of how do we move as African people, right? How do we understand this moment? We always have to remember that if we're saying that Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people, specifically in Gaza, but then also in the surrounding areas, we're seeing them spread out in the West Bank, and the surrounding occupied areas. We also have to be cognizant of that the IOF trains with our police departments, right? So what does it mean that they can very well do this so swiftly and easily to Palestinians, and they're training the police? And we have to look at the tactics like the knee on the neck that happened to George Floyd as tactics that have come from this training. Or why is Israel so dedicated and so, forcefully trying to make their way into the AU as observers? What are they doing there? Or why is Israel in Haiti? Or why is Israel in Colombia? Like, these are questions that we can really start investigating and interrogating about the Zionist state and its collusion and interlocking interests with the West, but more specifically the US.
Absolutely. And, Eric, I appreciate you connecting the Palestinian liberation struggle with the Black liberation struggle here in the United States, which has a very material connection, because we continue to see these sort of questions of, well, why should Black people, protest for Palestine? Why should we care? Some of these arguments, oftentimes quite dishonest in and of themselves, if not downright reactionary. But the fact of the matter is that imperialism abroad is connected to oppression and exploitation here inside the U.S. Also appreciate you raising the boycotts and such, because I see a lot of well-meaning people really harping on these individualistic actions while not really considering the strategic and tactical points that you're making. And the same thing for these sort of, loose calls for general strikes and things like that, as if this is something that we can just will into existence. I mean, that this is something that would take an incredible amount of organization that simply isn't present at this time in the US. Now, it's not something that's impossible, but what I want people to understand is that this energy is better directed into actual organizations that are working and organizing around Palestine and all of these other issues. And it's that collective struggle that is going to really make the change that we seek, and not the actions of self-selecting individuals. But we want to thank Erica Ryan so much for joining us today. Also want to thank our other guest, Netfa Freeman, for joining us today. That's going to do it for Darker Than Blue here today. Please join us next week for an all-new show. We will see you next time. Peace.
Peace.